Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I'm so excited. I'm holding in my hands a newly released volume, Anti-Semitism and Psychiatry. And I have with me esteemed psychiatrist Stephen Moffick, who's in Milwaukee and consented to do this interview with me. As you can see, he's the lead editor of this incredible volume. So, Steve, why this book and why now?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to discuss that. It's a little bit of a long story, which I'll make short. You may remember because you did a chapter for our prior book, which was on Islamophobia and psychiatry.
That
So,
you edited, we might add, too.
yes, and same company, and it was a multi-faith book of psychiatrists and other mental health people. And we finished it, and I was talking to the acquisition editor, and I said, well, this went so good, what should we do next? And I had my own idea. It was something like, let's do a book about how all aspects of mental health are deteriorating in our country and why. She said, oh, she lived in New York. Her name is Adita Prasad. She said, I got a better idea. I live in New York. Anti-Semitism is worsening here. Why don't you do kind of a sequel on anti-Semitism in psychiatry? And I thought to myself, you idiot, this is your people. Why didn't you think about this? But I was so grateful that she thought about it, and she wanted it done in the same way, an interfaith editorship and interfaith chapter writers. So we got right off the ground soon after the prior book was published. And as we know,
To know your son is a rabbi, and he was asked to do a chapter.
yep, he did the first one on the history of anti-Semitism because he had actually written his own book about anti-Semitism called First the Jews, the World's Oldest Hatred. So it was right up his alley too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good plug for his book. And yes, so it's I thumbed through it, and yes, so there's a Christian psychiatrist, John Petit, who I've been teaching a class for I don't know, almost 20 years now, has a chapter, and a Muslim psychiatrist who helped edit the Islamophobia book also did it. It's a fascinating read, and it's not just for psychiatrists, and not just for mental health professionals, but I think it really is an important volume for everyone to understand more about.
Yes, exactly. The original goal was it should have clinical orientation and be of value in everyday mental health practice. But secondarily, we wanted it to be readable enough for the public because this is a big societal problem beyond how it manifests itself in clinical care. So almost all the chapters are easily understood by the public. And in fact, the first invitation we had to speak about the book was from the 92nd Street Y in New York, a renowned place for cultural events and book releases. They wanted us to do a book release panel for the public, not for other professionals. So they got it.
Great. Did you happen to videotape that by any chance?
Well, it's coming Monday, for a plug. It's coming Monday,
Okay, so
at 7:30 in Manhattan.
let's have somebody videotape it for it. So I would like you to take a moment, you edited it. So what are some of the highlights in the book? I know we'll talk about my chapter about cults and hate groups, but what for you stands out as things that are unique in this volume, Steve?
Yeah, there's kind of two different kinds of chapters. There's one on different subject matter, and we can get into that a little bit. One I would just highlight, since you mentioned the multi-faith aspects, one of the chapters were written by Hindu psychiatrists with an underlying thesis, and I looked this over very carefully myself, is that there's been virtually no anti-Semitism from Hindus, ever.
Interesting.
Okay? Comparison to other religious groups. And so they wanted to do a chapter on that. I ended up co-editing with them because I was concerned of the veracity of it, and it seems to be true. The implication, therefore, is that Jewish people, in our endeavor to have multi-faith relationships, which we've been pretty successful about lately, we ought to include Hindus in that because they look like they're a real ally. So there's different topics, including your own chapter. And then there's some interesting personal narratives about what anti-Semitism meant to psychiatrists growing up and becoming adults. And they're pretty fascinating. One of them actually includes original artwork. This is one by Barry Marcus. He has original collages which supplements his text. And then we have one by a psychiatrist named John Cameron, very well-known psychiatrist outside of New York. He basically grew up as a waspish kind of Jew, meaning his family tried to conform to the WASP cultural.
To assimilate.
To assimilate, yeah, and he did. But later on, connected to his son's mental illness, he sort of realized how stigmatized that point of view was, and started to become more overtly Jewish, and wrote about it and so forth. But he said in doing this chapter, this was the most important thing he ever wrote. It was from his heart. He learned about himself in a much deeper way. And so these chapters were almost therapeutic for the people who wrote them. And I think readers will find them very interesting because they're all different, but grappling what it meant to grow up as a Jew, how that interrelated with being a psychiatrist or another mental health professional.
Right. And I noticed there was a chapter about the intergenerational transmission of trauma from the Holocaust. Right? Can you say a few things about that?
Yeah, so important. So that was done by one of our co-editors, a new one for this volume named Mary Seaman. She's a well-known psychiatrist from Canada, and her family came from Poland, and she talks about the family's experience in leaving Poland, but then the transmission of trauma throughout generations, and working a fair amount myself with Holocaust survivors and what's involved with their second generation kids and even grandkids. The challenge is that if you don't do something about it, the reaction to the trauma is liable to seep down to the next generation for two reasons. One of them is nurture. That is, what are the parents conveying to the kids as they're growing up about, say, their anxiety about going through the trauma and how it affected them? So kids can pick that up unless the parents are careful. And then it could even be transmitted genetically. So if the trauma occurred before childbearing years, once the child is conceived, then they can have this genetic predisposition to be more anxious than usual. In fact, one of the survivors, second generation kids from Milwaukee, when I told her about the book, she said, you know what, I've just been tested for cortisol because of this issue. And it looks like it's high for no other reason possibly than this. My kid was tested, her cortisol is also higher than normal. So that's a reflection of being kind of on guard all the time without really knowing that you are. So
cortisol is a stress
hormone.
Correct?
Yes, exactly.
And so it can have all kinds of other implications for your physical well-being if your cortisol is too high, if I understand that correctly.
Yes, exactly. So it's important for survivors to know this because, and for their kids and grandkids to know this, because then they can potentially do something about it. It's like, well, we don't have to react as if the Holocaust is still in the background. Our lives are different now, and you could use techniques like meditation and so forth to keep yourself calmer, and so it has practical implications.
Right, and if I'm not mistaken, there's a chapter on anti-Semitic violence. It's a Charlottesville and maybe the Pittsburgh synagogue attack. Yeah,
this is a unique chapter as far as I know. There's been a lot written about the Pittsburgh synagogue tragedy, right? But this chapter author is from Pittsburgh. She doesn't work within the city now, grew up in the same neighborhood. She decided she wanted to interview people who were directly connected with that trauma. And so she interviewed about a dozen people about how that trauma affected them, how they're living their life since then. I've never seen these kinds of interviews before. They were both with lay people and professionals. And
Uh-huh.
then she developed her own ideas about what they should do to help themselves and also address anti-Semitism, and time goes on. It's just fascinating chapter, unique.
Right. And I guess I want to just add from my experience, and thank you for the invitation to write a chapter in this volume. I grew up in a conservative Jewish family in Queens, New York, educated about the Holocaust, educated about 1984 and Animal Farm and all kinds of psychology experiments and such. And yet I was deceptively recruited at Queens College into a front group of a Korean fascist cult.
Yes.
And as an indoctrinated, cult member, I came to be told all kinds of anti-Semitic things that I didn't realize was anti-Semitic, because I wasn't in my values and in my authentic self. But we were literally told things like, oh yes, the Holocaust needed to happen to indemnify the Jews for not accepting Jesus, and how God had taken the blessing from the Jews to give it to the Koreans for the new Messiah in Korea. And I became so fanatical through the indoctrination process. Fortunately, my family intervened, and I came to learn about brainwashing in China, and then started my new career in psychology and really wanting to understand how the mind can be programmed by cult groups and hate groups. And the co-author for my chapter is a independent scholar, John Kavan Atack, who is himself in Scientology for many years. And it was a very interesting and important chapter to just get it out there that I'm not a bad person. I had a good family upbringing. I had a good religious education. I went to Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvah. But this happened to my mind, and the good news is it unhappened, that I was able to come back to myself and reconnect with my Jewish identity and roots. And I've been involved with a temple here in Brookline, Massachusetts for the last few decades. And I think it's so important to be anchored in our traditions. And to really understand Torah and understand you can't take it literally, and what many people try to do is read a version of the Old Testament and project a Christian frame on Judaism. And Jews don't believe in original sin. We don't believe in Satan and evil spirits attacking us. We believe in mind-body unity. Not this notion of the body is evil and therefore you need to be at odds with. There's so many fundamental theological differences that I think most Christians don't understand or appreciate. And I want to do a quick shout out for a Baptist minister, Harvey Cox, who wrote a book called Common Prayers for Christians about Judaism, and saying, look, Jesus was a Jew, so understand the roots of what Judaism teaches. And it was a very interesting and important volume. So having said that, I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to convey before we wrap up our interview. It's a very important volume.
A couple of things just to play on what you just said. I'm going to have to tell my son, my rabbi son, about the person you just mentioned, because he also wrote a book about the Jewishness of Jesus from the Jewish perspective. And it's so important to understand the tie that Jesus had both to Jews and Christians.
What's the title, Steve? I want to pick that one up.
I think it's called The Jewishness of Jesus. It's published by Abington Press. And his
Evan Moffick.
Evan Moffick, yeah.
Same last name, rabbi. And he's a rabbi out in Milwaukee?
Chicago. I mean, at the outskirts of Chicago, actually, in Highland Park. It's called Macomb Solel Lakeside.
Okay.
So all I would probably add is the last chapter of the book which I happen to write with a very exaggerated title, Is There a Cure for Anti-Semitism? Because really the essence of the book, nothing like this has been written for 30 years. So the essence of it was, we know anti-Semitism is increasing in the United States, in Europe, in the Middle East. All kinds of endeavors have been going on in the last 5-10 years to address that. And as good as they are, and I think they're terrific, they're not good enough, right? We need other ways to make progress. So I thought mental health people, understand the mind better than most professions, and we should have something to contribute to that. So my big underlying goal was, can we think about other ideas that haven't been tried that may help this issue?
Mm-hmm.
And so those are summarized in the last chapter, and I'll just give a hint of some of them. We mentioned one of them, that we develop interfaith relationship with Hindus.
Right.
Another idea is, what really is anti-Semitism? How should it be classified? So, it's classified somewhat as a hatred, but should it be medicalized in a way? Is it what we might call a social disease? Is it like what Freud talked about for individuals, psychopathology of everyday life? That's worth thinking about, because if you medicalize it some, and there's dangers in that, but it also leads to different ideas about treatment. So that's one thing to think about. We use the term melting pot in the United States. The melting of cultures. Is that good for Jews and other people who want to retain their culture? I don't really think so. I think a better metaphor might be a potluck dinner, where you bring nourishing food from each of your cultures. So I think that would be a better metaphor for the country,
I like that.
And what about treatment? Is it possible to treat people who are anti-Semitic? That's been really hard. I think the major way, say, people from hate groups change their mind is when they run into people who treat them compassionately, say other Jews who treat them compassionately and with understanding, and then they sort of realize what they were thinking wasn't true. But what if we could develop a technique that's, say, like anger management for people who are angry? It's not like saying you've got a mental illness, but a technique to learn how to overcome your anger. And maybe we could do the same thing for anti-Semitism, because there is anger at the basis of that. So we throw out a lot of possible new things to do, which actually just build on old endeavors. One more, because it just is occurring in Wisconsin and other states. There's a big thrust to integrate Holocaust education into young children's education.
Yes.
Great goal. It got legalized just recently in Wisconsin. That's terrific. But maybe even besides that, or in addition, how are we going to educate the parents of these kids? And why is that so important? Well, there was a psychologist who did research on righteous Gentiles after the Holocaust, and tried to find out what was in common with these people. And the main thing that was in common was parents who taught their kids tolerance and to value other cultures. And that was the most thing in common. So how do we get to the parents of kids besides the school teachers and the kids themselves? So that's another idea we're throwing out there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think about a book by a retired now child protection advocate, social worker, David Cooperson, who wrote a book called The Holocaust Lessons, actually, against corporal punishment. And he cited a particular study in people who resisted the Nazis' demands to turn over their neighbors, the Jews. And it was people who were not beaten as children to obey their parents' authority were more likely to resist.
That makes sense, yeah.
So that's really interesting as well. I also just want to mention that Arno Michaelis, who's a friend of mine, who was a white power neo-Nazi skinhead, musician, recruiter, and what melted him was kind Jews,
yes.
people who like a boss that gave him a sandwich because he was hungry and treated him nicely, because the dissonance between the hatred indoctrination and the warmth of real people who were treating you respectfully helped to melt it. And ultimately, when he had a child, he started developing a consciousness of, do I want my child to live with so much hatred? Like, what kind of world do I want my child to be in? And that also helped him wake up. And now he de-radicalizes people. That's what he spends all of his time. And he partners with a Sikh whose father had been murdered by a white power person. I think out your way, if I'm not mistaken.
Because there was a tragedy out there with Sikhs being murdered. Yeah, that kind of relationship is so crucial, because people have a tendency to confront and criticize people who have different points of views, including white nationalists, if you're Jewish or Black or whatever. And that doesn't work. You know, in we can refer to Jewish history for that sort of reason. It's like Pharaoh's heart was hardened over and over, and he wouldn't let the Jews leave. We don't want to harden people's hearts by confronting them. We want to form a relationship where, in essence, we come to respect and the kindness, you know, converge on a loving relationship. That's what changes people's hearts, not confronting them.
Yeah, and positive role modeling.
Yes.
And that's really, really important. So, you know, I know that you've written 1 million journal articles and books. You continue to want to contribute. And I want to thank you again for doing this really important book in this day and age. And hopefully you'll get some media attention and do some interviews. And more people will hear of the book and buy it and read it.
Yeah, thank you. And just in closing off, I got to thank all the co-editors. As far as a model for interfaith relationships, that was there, as well as all the chapter writers, including yourself. I think the process sort of modeled what we need to do in society.
That's great. And before I let you go, I got to ask you about your shirt.
Oh.
What are all these words on your shirt, Steve?
So I tried to get in the mood of what we were going to talk about. And this is my social justice shirt. So it has lots of sayings on it that refers to abuse of power, freedom of thought, that sort of stuff. So when I wear it, it sort of is both to reflect what I want to talk about, but also to get me in the right frame of mind.
Beautiful, beautiful. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you and possibly working together again in the future.
Again, yes, because we're on the verge of starting a 3rd book on Christianity and psychiatry. So,
oh my goodness. Okay, so thank you again.
Okay, thank you.